Hello and welcome to Moss Live. For today's Ask a Scientist, we're joined by three scientists who work in the field of cognitive neuroscience, studying things like how our brains grow and develop and what's going on when we think, especially about other people. They're here to tell us all about that and also to answer some questions from you. And first, my name is Meg. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm really excited to be your moderator for the program. If you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to start entering your questions using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like captions, you can also access those by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom and selecting Show Subtitles. Now, if you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, we're very happy to have you tune in, but unfortunately, we won't be able to see your questions at this time. All right, so let's get started. I'd like to first invite our guest scientists to turn on their cameras and mics and introduce themselves. So hello and welcome to Moss Live.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. So I'll start. I'm Rebecca Sachs. I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at MIT. And I was born in Toronto in Canada and grew up there thinking that when I grew up, I wanted to be a scientist because I wanted to understand how the complicated world around us is made up of tiny, simple parts, how things are made of molecules and bodies grow from DNA. And by the time I started studying science, I thought the coolest thing is that our mind is made up from patterns of activity in the cells of our brain. I thought that was really the coolest thing you could ever get to study. And I've been studying it ever since. And one of the things I study is how kids' brains grow and change what they can think. I get to study that at work, and I also get to study it at home because I have two kids at home, Arthur, who's 7 tomorrow, and Percy, who's 5.5. Brandon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Hey, everybody, I'm Brandon. Rebecca is my boss, and I just graduated in 2019, and I'm working at MIT looking at how people think about the emotions of other people based off of their actions. And if you're able to look at that from a math perspective, maybe you can formalize a systematic way in which we're able to do that. So how do people read the actions and emotions of others? And I'm from the DC, Maryland area, and I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis last year.
Hi,
Brandon, I just want to, I'm sorry, Heather. I want to jump in and ask, Brandon, do you have your camera? Could you turn it on?
Oh, it says that it's on now. Let me try and get better reception somewhere. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. Let's let you do that and we'll get back. Sorry, Heather.
So my name's Heather Koskowski. I had a pretty non-traditional path to science. So I grew up mostly in Massachusetts, but I moved around a lot because I was in foster care and my dad was in the military. And then I joined the military myself, so did a brief stint in the Marine Corps before having a baby and then finally deciding I should study science. And I fell in love with trying to understand how the infant brain works and helps infants to understand the world around them. And I had an amazing opportunity to get to work with Rebecca Sachs. And so now I get to study the infant brain and what sorts of things we can know about infants based on how their brain responds to certain types of stimuli.
That is great. Thank you all three for being here. We're really excited to have you. And well, before we get to our questions from the audience, and I already see several really good ones, I'll just ask a couple to get the ball rolling. We're talking about the brain, all the amazing things that it can do and how it develops to be able to do them. So I'm curious, Heather, how are infants' brains different from adult brains, or how are they the same?
Well, that's a great question. It might help to start thinking about, well, what does the adult brain do, right? So the adult brain does lots of fun, fancy things. It helps you think, it helps you do math, it helps you even walk. Everything you feel is represented in your brain. Everything you know is represented in your brain. Every memory you've ever had is stored in your brain. So the adult brain can do a whole lot of things, right? But a lot of those things you've learned. You're not born with the ability to read. You're not born with the ability to know that 1 + 1 = 2. And so the infant brain has this amazing capacity for learning. But it's super small. It's 1/3 the size. So an adult brain is this big. A baby brain is like this big. It's 1/3 the size of the adult brain. So it can't do everything that adult brains do, right? And so one of the things that I've learned with my research is some of the things that it does do that are similar to what adult brains do is we have parts of our brain as adults that help us recognize other people. We recognize when they're happy, we recognize when they're sad, we recognize that it is a person and somebody we know or like, or somebody that we're kind of scared of, or even who it is, like this is my mom, or this is my sister, or this is my friend. And those regions in the brain, we say they're face selective. It turns out babies have many of those same regions when they're born. Well, maybe not when they're born, but at least by the time they're 6 months old, which is pretty young if you ask me. And so there are lots of ways that the baby brain is different. It doesn't know math. They can't do math. Babies can't walk. But there are some surprising ways that it's similar. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's really neat. Well, switching to Brandon, being relatively early in your research career, what drew you to this particular field of study?
Cool. So I learned about the brain in the 3rd or 4th grade, so about the age of these kids here. And I really wanted to know like what made smart people smart, because my parents kind of got me to be really academically driven. I was like, why do I have to study a lot more than these other kids? Or why is this coming easier at the brain level than other kids? And so my tutor gave me a book on this brain doctor that was able to cut out half of a brain and the little girl was still able to live. And I was like, what the heck? Like, how's that even possible? And so I kind of got my interest from there. And then I learned about this way to learn and how learning happens in the brain. And that kind of hooked me ever since. And it made me realize and kind of give me a sense of hope that one, the brain is muscle-like, so we're able to improve ourselves at a cognitive and a mental level. And that gave me hope. And two, if we're able to do that, maybe I can be anything that I think I can be. And so that was pretty motivating and exciting for me personally.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. I'm gonna remember that. Rebecca, so how exactly do we see inside the human brain, and what are you looking for when you're looking?
Those are great questions. So most of the research that we do in my lab, we look into the brain using an MRI machine. You can actually see a picture of an MRI machine behind Heather. She's got a picture of herself scanning a baby right behind her. So that's a machine that measures, well, we use it to measure changes in blood flow through your brain. While you're using one bit of your brain, while it's super active, then you get more oxygen coming in the blood to that part of your brain. And we use the MRI to watch where blood is moving as people or children or babies are doing different jobs with their brains. And I see there's lots of amazing questions here already about our brains, about what parts they are and what they do. So maybe I'll start by answering one bit of it. This is connected to what Brandon said, so one of the things that our brains do is they make us smart. They let us think and they let us learn. And I see there's a bunch of questions from Vivian about that. She asks, what makes you smart? And are you smarter when you're younger or when you're older? So those are great questions. It turns out that the idea of being smart, it's made up of lots of different things, right? As you can imagine, just thinking about yourself and people you know, there's lots of different ways of being smart. And one of the ways of being smart is being able to learn, being able to change from your experiences. And actually, every part of your brain can do that. So this is not just one part of your brain, it's every different bit of your brain. The parts of your brain that control your body, for example, they change when you learn a new skill. Like if you imagine learning to juggle, I don't know how many people here can juggle. If you can't juggle yet and then you learn to juggle, then the parts of your brains that control your hands, they have to change. Or if you learn to play piano, right, then the parts of your brains that control your fingers, they have to change from that learning. But every part of your brain has to learn. Parts of your brain that you use for language, they change if you learn a new language. Maybe some people here are learning a second language in school, and that's changing other bits of their brain. So the first thing you need to know is that learning happens everywhere in your brain by your brain changing, and you're better at that when you're younger. So in that way, younger people are smarter than older people, if what you mean by smart is being able to learn new things. On the other hand, there's other ways that your brain makes you smart. And one of them is it makes you smart about risk, right? It makes you figure out what's dangerous and how to make good decisions for the future. And that's actually something people get better at when they're older. So other ways of being smart, like making careful decisions about the future, those ones are ways that older people are better. And so often kids are better at learning, but they can use their grown-ups to help them with foresight.
That was a great answer and great questions, Vivian. So we do have a bunch of awesome questions coming in. I want to remind everyone who's joining us on Zoom that if you have a question and you'd like to ask it, just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Let's see, I see Nico also asking many questions, and I am curious about this one because it relates to what Brandon was saying, got him inspired in the first place. Can the brain survive surgery? Anyone, any of you would like to take a, no pun intended, a stab at that?
Brandon, why don't you start?
Sure, I can give it a try. So one, the brain definitely can survive surgery, and that was the main reason why I got interested in all this stuff. It depends on which region you poke at. So there's some regions towards the bottom of the brain where they're more responsible for things like your heart rate and your more vital organs. But if you poke at things on the top of the brain, you can make your right arm move. You can probe certain types of memories. You can inhibit certain types of movements. But the beauty of the brain, I think, is that you can survive that because of the thing that Rebecca was talking about, which is your brain can learn different types of associations. And there's a way that the little cells in our brain do that, which is called neuroplasticity. And two brain cells can connect through the release of different types of chemicals. But if you cut out half the brain, you're cutting out essentially half of those connections. But the beautiful thing about how we have evolved is that you're able to, one, not only make sure that those brain cells don't die, but two, make sure that those brain cells are able to reconnect in a fashion that is best for our growth and development and our goals. And so the main thing of neuroscience is, one, what promotes that process, and two, what I study, which is the behavioral outputs of those biological changes. So Heather talks about the biological side of it, and I kind of focus on what that biological side promotes in a behavioral sense.
Oh, it's really interesting, those two things working together. I have another question here from Jay Duff, wondering about whether sociocultural theory plays any role in your research, which makes me think about something that Professor Rebecca Sachs has worked on quite a bit, which is the region in your brain, if I'm understanding this right, that responds when you're thinking about what other people are thinking. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you totally do. And that is a great question. One of the things I'm definitely interested in is not just how we grow up to have the brains we have, but the role that our culture plays in how we learn to think and how our brains change as we grow up. So one example that's related to this, if you think about, for example, you're at school and another kid at school has a cupcake that they brought from home that they're very excited to eat. But when you see the cupcake, you don't know that it belongs to anybody. It's just on the teacher's desk. So you don't know that it's anybody's special cupcake from home. Now, if you ate that cupcake, the question is, how much trouble should you get in from the teacher for eating the friend's very special cupcake? Now, most kids especially by the time they're 9 or 10, tell us if you didn't know that it was somebody else's cupcake, then it was an accident and you shouldn't get in so much trouble for taking the cupcake. Though if you knew that it was your friend's special cupcake from home, then you would get in a lot of trouble for taking it. So that's a way that we think about other people's minds and thoughts. We consider, when we decide whether what they did was good or bad, we consider what they knew and what they intended. And one of the things we've studied in my lab is how your brain does that and how kids learn to do that as they get older. But another thing that turns out to be really cool is that it's very different in different cultures, how much it matters what you knew or what you intended. So for example, here in Massachusetts, kids by the time they're 9 say, it really matters what you knew. If you didn't know that it was your friend's cupcake, then you shouldn't get in as much trouble for taking it. But in other parts of the world, that's not what kids and even grown-ups say. Grown-ups say that if you hurt a friend by taking their cupcake, you should get in trouble no matter what you knew. And so that's an example where the cultural context that we grew up in changes how our minds come to work, even in these very abstract ways. And that's a kind of question we're interested in my lab. How does that cultural context affect how we think and affect how our brains develop?
Oh, that's super interesting. I have a question here from Sonia, age 10, wondering why do we forget things after we learn them? So I don't know which of you wants to field that, but that's a great question.
Heather, you want that one? I think that's great. The question, why do we forget things? So actually, it turns out there's a lot of debate about what forgetting is. One thing that scientists have been debating for actually about 100 years is when you have forgotten something, in the sense that maybe you've forgotten what you ate for lunch yesterday. And if I asked you, what did you eat for lunch yesterday? You would say, I don't know, I forgot. Now, the question is the memory of what you ate for lunch still in your brain in some sense? So you can't tell it to me, you can't find it, but it's still in there. And if I could measure directly inside your brain, I could still find it. And there's at least some cases where that's definitely true, where what happens isn't that the memory isn't there, it's that you can't find it. But scientists could actually look inside your brain and find the memory that you yourself can't find by thinking. So that happens sometimes, but that's not the only way we forget things. It turns out also that we can forget things, for example, by changing the memory. So if you think of, for example, a favorite birthday party you had 5 years ago, if you've thought about that birthday party a lot of times, it turns out that each time you think about that memory, you slightly change it inside your brain, because bringing it to mind changes the memory inside your brain. And so after many, many years of thinking about a memory, the memory you have is not the memory you started with. It's actually different, and it has different bits in it. And some of those bits might never have happened, and some things that might have happened aren't there anymore. And so if you take two people who are at the same birthday party 5 years later, they might have quite different memories of what happened, even though both are saying honestly how they remembered it.
I have another question from Sonia that I'm going to direct to Heather, partly because I want to add to it. She wants to know, is there a difference between a mind and a brain? And my sort of add-on question is whether you would answer that question differently for an infant versus an adult.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one I think about a lot, actually. And she also, I noticed, had an interesting question about whether or not remote learning is impacting her brain and the effect of social interaction. So I think I'm going to try to get both of those kind of in the same section. Yes, there is a difference between the mind and the brain, but no, there's no difference between it at all. It's kind of complicated when you think about it that way, right? So the way we talk about the mind is more like our behaviors and the way we think about the world. And the way we talk about the brain is that actual piece of tissue housed in our skull. But actually, the brain creates the mind. So everything you think, everything you know, everything you understand, we consider when we're talking about it, that to be the mind. But the mind can't exist without the brain. And the brain, so a lot of people asked, how does the brain work? The brain is composed of a bunch of cells called neurons. There's billions of these neurons in your brain, and there's a whole bunch of different types, and they talk to each other in lots of different ways. And the more you teach some of those neurons to talk to each other, the more they stay together and represent or help you learn about the same things. And the more you do things that keep some neurons apart, the less you remember those things. So for one example of that is like when you're a baby, you can understand any sound that's produced in any language, right? But then when you get older, you can no longer understand sounds that aren't produced in the language that you learned when you were a baby. So think about people that you might know in school that moved to the United States from a different country. Sometimes some of their words are a little bit pronounced a little bit differently, and you can notice that it sounds different to you, but they might not think it sounds different to them. And so that thing where it sounds different to you than it does to them, that's what we call the mind. But that thing, but the actual instantiation of it, the actual way our neurons are talking to each other in order to make that happen, that's what we call the brain. But again, when we talk about it, it sounds like they're two different things, but they're actually the same thing. And then your second question about remote learning, I have the same concern. My daughter is 11, and I worry because I know how important social relationships at your age are. You need your friends. And we know that social learning is a really important way for kids to learn. You learn more when you're learning with your friends than you do when you're just being taught from a teacher. And so some work that Rebecca has done with older kids, adults, like college age students, has shown that people without other people around tend to have a little bit of a harder time. And their brains, it shows up in their brains a little bit. But I think that one of the amazing things about this era, and there's still a lot to learn about it, we don't know all of the answers, is that because of things like Zoom and all of the technology we have, there are different ways that your teachers are helping you to learn to engage with each other socially. And so we don't know if remote learning is ultimately going to be bad or not. And we don't know the impacts it will have on your brain, because it's really the first time our world has ever done anything like this. But we always, so social learning is very important. But I think that remote learning, teachers are doing a lot to try to make it as social as possible so we can stay safe, right?
Great answer. Thank you, Heather. We have a lot of really interesting questions here. So I think I want to direct one of these to Brandon, if I could. How do the conscious versus unconscious parts of our mind play into how we react to emotions?
Oh, that's a great question. Wow, geez, that's a great question. Okay, cool.
Feel free to pass it off if you don't want to answer.
I would love to answer it. It's no problem at all. So I think the first question in that is, where's the line between unconscious and conscious? So if I ask Heather a question and she has an assumption that she doesn't think that needs to be said, I may assume that that process may be happening unconsciously when it very well is happening consciously. And so that is a really big problem in studying the psychology of how we think about others, is that we don't state all of our assumptions. And so that, I think, is a really great kind of rationale and test bed for why Rebecca is studying theory of mind, is that if we can't probe our own conscious and unconscious states, kind of that kind of fine line, maybe we can think about how we think about other people, because we have a more objective standpoint. So with regards to how me as Brandon, how I have emotions, that's kind of really hard for me to answer. But if I see Heather bang her hands against the desk because something went wrong, I may assume that she's angry. And these inferred states and these inferred beliefs that I have on Heather can act as a kind of a good proxy or a good relationship to what I think Heather is feeling. So the beliefs and desires of Heather can be inferred through her actions, and that kind of inference or that kind of guess is more strongly supported by me thinking about how Heather thinks versus me thinking about how I think, because I may not expose myself of certain assumptions that I have, and other people may consider those to be unconscious. So one, that's a great question. Two, I think as technology evolves and stuff, I think we'll be able to develop a lot better ways to answer that in a more formal and subjective way.
It is a great question. I want to get to a couple more here, and I want to. Aninia says, "Do our brains stop working when we sleep?" That's a good question.
That's a great question. I'll take that one. So no, not at all. In fact, your brain, when you're asleep, is busy learning the patterns of the information that you got during the day. This is totally amazing, actually. If you teach people something new just before they go to sleep, and then test how much they learned when they wake up, you find that people remember more. They learned the information better if you let them sleep right after they learned it than if they learn that same information. Then they have awake time when they're doing lots of other stuff, and then you test them, even if it's the same time apart. So if you teach somebody something new and then you give them a nap or a night's sleep, by the time they wake up, they know more about that thing they just learned than if you taught them that new thing in the morning. So sleeping seems to be a really important time for our brains to reorganize and find the kind of signal in the noise, and so have learned the thing that we were experiencing during the day. And some people have the idea that maybe that's why babies spend so much of their time asleep, because everything about the world is so new. Basically, every time they open their eyes, they're learning so much, and it fills them up, and they have to go to sleep in order to give their brain a chance to basically learn that information before they wake up again. So your brain is doing lots and lots of activity, busy work, sorting out your day, getting everything ready to go while you're asleep. It has definitely not stopped working.
Okay, we'll take another question here from Nico, one of our prolific question askers today. If you had only one half of the brain, what would happen? And what if it were only 1/3 of the brain? What then?
Yeah, I think
Heather,
that's a great question. And so I'm going to try to tackle that because I think it's fascinating too. It turns out it depends on what parts of the brain you lose. Lots of people have done lots of experiments to try to understand this better. But in humans, the way we study this the most is when by some unfortunate accident, somebody loses a part of their brain. And then we try to test the people who have lost parts of their brain to see what functions they maintain and what functions they lose. And people can have really bad accidents at lots of different ages. So to all of you, here's a public service announcement. If you're riding your bicycle or skateboarding or rollerblading, make sure you wear your helmets. And if you're in the car, always listen to your parents and put on your seatbelts. Okay. Now, we don't want any of you to lose any parts of your brains. You should not be subjects in our studies. Okay, great. But for the people that have lost parts of their brain, what they found is there's one type of lesion. When you lose a part of your brain, we call it a lesion. It turns out there's one kind of lesion that we call modular. What that means is if you get a lesion to this part of your brain, it doesn't matter if it happens when you're a kid or when you're an adult, you're going to lose that ability. So one example of that is the hippocampus. It's this funny seahorse-shaped part of your brain that's buried way deep inside, and it helps you with memories. There's been lots of questions about memories and different parts of the brains and stuff like that. So hippocampus is one part that helps you with memories. And they found that it doesn't matter if you lose this early in life or late in life, you lose your ability for some types of memory. So that's kind of interesting, right? This is a part of your brain. Doesn't matter when you lose it, you lose that ability. But there's another kind of lesion that can occur called, and we call this plasticity, like for plastic brain regions. And so this is, if you lose a region that is usually specialized for that function early in life, you still learn that ability. It just goes to a different part of the brain. So one example of that is language. Usually, in many typically developing kids, language ability will be stored on the left side of your brain. But if kids get a lesion to the left side of their brain, then they're still able to learn language. It just turns into the right side of the brain. But here's a funny part. It maybe not funny, unfortunate. It's really sad, actually. Adults, if they lose that same part of their brain, after they've learned their language, they lose some of their language ability. It's a little bit more complex about which types of language abilities they lose and what part of the brain and stuff like that. But basically, that's how it goes. Then there's a third type. This astonished me when I heard of it. So I wonder if it'll astonish all of you too. And more work needs to be done to show if this is true and how that works. But there's a part of your brain that if you lose it early in life, there's much greater deficit than if you lose it later in life. We call these brain regions vulnerable. And so one example is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And it helps you with judgment. And lots of people have thought that helps you with this very specific kind of learning. And if you lose that early in life, then when you're an adult, you have a much harder time with certain kinds of judgments. But if you lose that part of your brain when you're an adult, you don't have as hard a time with those kinds of judgments. And so there are different things that can happen when you lose different parts of your brain, and it depends on what age you are when you lose those parts of the brain. But really, we don't want any of you to lose any parts of your brain. So make sure you wear your helmets and wear your seatbelts.
Yeah, thank you for that public service announcement. That's very important. And that really looks like all the time that we have. Thank you. So many fantastic questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to them all. I do have like one final question for the panelists before we say goodbye. If you had one piece of advice for our younger audience members who might be interested in pursuing a career in science, maybe even cognitive neuroscience, what would your one piece of advice for them be? Anyone?
I mean, that's like the hardest possible question, right? I think so. For me, it's really personal, the answer. When my daughter was a little baby, I looked at her and I knew that I wanted the world for her, and I wanted her to believe that she could do whatever she wanted, kind of what Brandon was talking about at the beginning. And I realized that in order for her to believe that she could do that, I would need to achieve my dreams. And so my one piece of advice would be, no matter how hard life gets, or no matter how unfair the world seems, just pursue your dreams. It's hard, and it comes from like, it's not always possible. So some of you might not be able to, but hold on to the dream, whatever it is. And maybe at some point in life, you'll be given the opportunity.
Thank you.
I think adding on to Heather's point, going back to what the essence of neuroscience is, kind of studying the biological way in which we learn. And notice that none of us said that biological and psychological change is easy. And so I think that if you're trying to do something new and look into neuroscience and look into this field or do whatever you're trying to do, recognize that it's supposed to be hard, because if you're purposely trying to do something new, you're purposely rewiring your brain. And so in order for that biological change to happen, you have to put your brain under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure in order for it to change. So me growing up was not necessarily like a science guy or a math guy, but I realized that my interest overrode whatever my kind of prejudgments or weaknesses were in those fields. And I forced myself to get better at those fields and in mathematics and in computer science and that type of thing. And so that neuroplasticity that Heather was talking about and Rebecca was talking about only comes from hours of honing on your craft and doing what you think you want to do, regardless of what other people say, because it's not anybody else's brain, it's yours, and it's your responsibility to kind of make the best out of it, I think.
Thanks, Brandon. Any last advice?
I don't even really want to talk after those amazing, inspiring statements by my students. I guess I think that one of the real benefits of being a scientist of the mind is that it makes you stay curious, that things that seem obvious about how the world is or how people are, if you only experience them from your own one life, once you try to think about it like a scientist, it kind of makes you consider the much wider range of lives there are to live and human beings it's possible to be. and to try to understand that bigger picture. I think science takes a combination of, incredibly big ambitions, right? To understand the mind. I mean, in some sense, that's the most ridiculously large ambition you could possibly have. And just like Brandon was saying, you have to balance that with humility, right? We understand so little. We have so far to go to understand human minds and brains. And if you can be okay in the balance of both, right? In the hugeness of the ambition and the limits of what we already know and can do, I think if you can keep your enthusiasm and your curiosity in the middle between those two things, then you can be a scientist.
Oh, great advice, all three of you. Thank you. So I will invite our wonderful panelists to say goodbye at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
And we'll let you guys turn off your cameras and your mics. And we have just one moment here. Let's get set up. That was really amazing, you guys. And we got a lot of really wonderful questions. We're just going to say, we really have a lot of great stuff going on over at Moss at Home. So please follow us on social media or check out our website at www.mos.org/mosathome. And if you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the museum by visiting us at engage.mos.org/welcome. Your support will help us provide science experiences online and help us ensure that this kind of content can be accessed from home at no cost. So thank you again so much for joining us, and thanks to our wonderful guest scientists. We had a really great time with you today, and we will see you next time.